ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming to our show. We have Lior Haiat, the spokesperson of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a wonderful person, a very cultured person, a person who has great knowledge and experience in foreign matters, and also was the consul general in Miami. Now he's in Israel, and he has done great wonders for the Foreign Ministry department. And he's a person that is able to reach out to people and is very accessible. He has tremendous, of course, knowledge of Israel, and is a person that you'll see can explain many things about Israel and why Israel does what it does and why it's so important to support Israel. Thank you so much for coming to our show.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be there, to be here in Shalom from Jerusalem.
Thank you. So first of all, how is Jerusalem, first of all?
Well, it's kind of hot here. Summer in Israel, as you know, it's closer, it's similar to summer in Miami, but there's no place like Jerusalem, as you all know.
Sure. How long have you been in the Foreign Ministry department service?
I've recently celebrated 20 years as an Israeli diplomat. I joined in 2001 through the cadet course of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And throughout the years, I've served in Argentina, in Spain, obviously as consul general in Miami, but I also served as deputy spokesperson and the director for Central America and the Caribbean islands.
Would you say to be a foreign ministry is something very worthwhile and people should join the department if they can?
I think that being an Israeli diplomat, representing Israel is all I could ever ask for. This is my dream come true, and I don't know of many people that can wake up every day and know that what they're doing is exactly what their work is exactly what they want to do in their life. I don't think there is anything that I want to do more than represent the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And I'm not sure that it's suitable for everyone, because being a diplomat means that you have to travel around the world, live in different culture, move from one place to another. It's especially suitable for people that are flexible and are open to new cultures and new adventures.
How long does it take to become a diplomat or in the foreign ministry?
Well, I'm still working on that, but the course itself is 6 months, around 6 months, but one of my former ambassadors told me that you actually you learn how to be a diplomat while you're doing diplomatic work, and that's as I said, I'm still learning new stuff every day, and it's been an incredible experience to get to work with different people and touch different topics practically every day.
Wonderful. So that being the case, Tony, you said before you get up in the morning and you're so happy to defend and represent Israel. So I'm going to ask you some tough questions. I hope you don't mind. But the question
That's what I'm here for.
Okay. People say, why defend Israel? What's so important? You know, we see things in the news and so forth. Israel is tough on the Palestinians and Israel is not nice and Zionism is racism and so forth. So why should you be proud of defending Israel? What would you say to that?
I have so many ways to answer the question, but I'll answer it in a very personal point of view. I think that the creation of the state of Israel is one of the amazing wonders that happened in the 20th century. It's a miracle that touches not only the Jewish people and obviously not only the Israelis, but it's a miracle that has to do with the entire humankind. And the fact is that so many people celebrate the creation of the state of Israel, the Independence Day, whether they're Jews, Israelis, or non-Jews. Some of them have never been to Israel and they still celebrate Israel Independence Day, and some of them will never visit Israel and they still consider Israel to be part of their day-to-day life. I think there are a lot of things that criticism about Israel that we have to consider and that we have to take into account. But there's a lot more that there are a lot of fake news about Israel a lot of propaganda that is led by the enemies of Israel that is trying to delegitimize the state of Israel. The state of Israel is, or the reason for the creation of the state of Israel is to be the homeland of the Jewish people. We have came back to our homeland. We have created a society that is both open and liberal, but also preserves our roots, our religion, and obviously our customs and traditions. Israel is a country like any other country, and it has a right to defend itself like any other country, and it does a lot of things since the day one, since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, to achieve peace in the Middle East. On a personal note, a few months ago, I was on the first Israeli delegation to Abu Dhabi as part of the Abraham Accords. And I remember standing, I was in a few days before the official delegation came, I arrived in Abu Dhabi. And on the day that the first El Al flight, direct flight from Israel to Abu Dhabi landed, it was also the first flight, Israeli flight, they flew over Saudi Arabia. And I was in the Royal Terminal in the Abu Dhabi airport waiting to see the El Al airplane landing. And I got a call from Channel 12 News in Israel. And they asked me, they told me, we have no one there. Can you actually tell us what's going on? And I started talking. I had no talking points. I wasn't prepared. And I just talked from my heart. And I said, I'm here. This is what I've been waiting for since I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to be part of the peace process. This is a dream for so many Israelis. And I think that the way Israel sees the peace in the Middle East, the way we want to be part of a relationship with our neighbors is unique. And I really hope that there will come a day that our neighbors, and some of our neighbors that are not yet in the peace circle, will understand that Israel could be a very beneficial neighbor for them as well.
That was a wonderful day. I remember I saw your post when you were there in Dhabi, and what an amazing moment, beginning the peace accord between our two peoples. A question is, because people will ask, okay, it's very nice, we're making peace now with the other Arab states and so forth, and hopefully we'll go to new levels where we will start to have a breakdown of all barriers. But what about the Palestinians? Don't they have a right to their country? And something else too, you've been away from 2,000 years. So why can you claim again that you belong to the land of Israel? You've been there for 2,000. Go back, stay where you are in Europe, stay where you are in the Arab lands. Why Israel?
First of all, we've never left Israel. There were always Jews living in Israel. My family is from Tzfat, and we've been in Tzfat since the 16th century. And I don't know of many other people that can actually date their arrival to Israel to the 16th century as my family and many other families have. The Jewish people left Israel by force. We didn't want to live. We were expelled, but Israel never left the Jewish people. The fact is that when we say Leshana Haba B'Yerushalayim is the root of Zionism. We want to go back to Jerusalem, to the land of Israel, not just as individuals, but also as a nation. And it's true. And we have a conflict with the Palestinians. This conflict dates for even before the creation of the State of Israel. Israel has done a lot in order to achieve peace with the Palestinians. Unfortunately, the Palestinians are not, or did not use the opportunities that we had in order to achieve peace, nor in 1947, nor in the year 2000, or even in the 90s, or in any other peace process that we had in the Middle East. I do think that the solution for the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is a direct negotiation in order to achieve peace between Israel and the Palestinian people. They're, if they do want their own state, if they do want to live under their own sovereignty, they could have done it before and will be happy to achieve that under a peace agreement. The problem is not they're wanting to live or to have a state by Israel. The question is there are terror organizations like Hamas in Gaza that actually wants to wipe Israel out of the map. And they, by doing so, also kill all the Jews that live in Israel and around the world. This is part of the reality in Israel. We have to understand that those factors, those players within the Palestinian politics are a part of the obstacles for peace. And mostly, since the creation of Israel, the main obstacle for achieving peace between Israel and the Palestinians was the decision by the Palestinians not to agree to a Jewish state or a homeland of the Jewish people represented by the state of Israel.
Question, because you're a person in the government, you know things that other people wouldn't know. Is it true that in 1947, the partition plan that the UN gave, and there'd be two states, because that really was a two-state solution, 47 partition plan, did anyone or any Jewish village or any Arab village or town, so forth, would have been displaced had there been accepted a two-state solution, 47, 48 by the Arabs? Would everybody still remain where they were, or would people be displaced? Did that happen?
It happened because of the independence war in the 1948. The day after the Declaration of Independence, 7 Arab countries attacked Israel, not in order to achieve or to create a Palestinian state, but in order to wipe Israel off the map. Unfortunately for them, they lost, and Israel was created, and we have suffered wars that by other wars that were their goals were to annihilate the state of Israel. Nevertheless, we've never left this idea of achieving peace. Even in as we speak, this message that we send, we do want to achieve peace with our Palestinian neighbors. We've paid a huge price for peace in the past. We've achieved peace with Egypt in 1979. Egypt was our worst enemy. The worst wars that we fought were against the Egyptians, and we've achieved peace with Jordan, and then we've achieved peace with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan. There are other countries that would love to join this circle of peace, hopefully soon. And the Palestinians should join this party as well, because it's not just for the sake of Israel, it's for the future of the Palestinian people, for their kids, for our kids. This is the only solution for the conflict in the Middle East.
Just in terms of the previous question, is that my question like this follows. If in 47, 48, the 7 Arabs would not have attacked us, and they would recognize our rights to Israel, would anyone have been displaced? Many Arab village have been displaced, or everybody would just be in their particular village or town? That would have happened if I'm saying an if situation.
The partition plan did not explain exactly how the population will be divided between the two states, the Jewish state on one side and the Arab state on the other side. There were Jews that were living before the partition plan in territories that would have been part of the Arab country or our Arab state, and there are Arabs that lived in the territory that was planned to be the Jewish state. Some of those Arabs actually stayed in Israel. There was no plan to expel them or to have them move to a different country. And those Arabs are the Israeli Arabs. They represent 21% of the Israeli population. They are actually the only Arabs in the Middle East that live under a democratic system. And just a few days ago, for the very first time, an Arab party is part of the coalition that created the Israeli government. And I do think that there is a process by Israeli Arabs that they want to be more involved in the Israeli way of life, and politics is one of those the ways that they show this involvement.
That's a very good point. So basically, you're saying had there been no attack from the seven Arab armies, yes, there would have been two-state solution. No one would have to be displaced. Yeah, there would have been Arabs under Israeli Jewish law rule, and there'd be Jews under Arab rule, but no one had been displaced. This whole displacement would have never occurred. And so we see that basically it's an unfortunate outcome of the war of seven Arab armies who just attacked the Jewish people. People forget that in 1945 we had already lost 6 million people, and 2.5 years later we were 650,000 people in the land of Israel, and seven Arab armies came to attack us. So it would have been a second Holocaust. What it would have
exactly
done.
That's what actually their claim to war. They wanted to wipe Israel off the map and kill the Jews that live in Israel. And unfortunately, and miraculously, that did not happen. And the fact that the newly born Israeli Jewish state, Israel, could defend itself against those attacks, it's nothing short of a miracle. But the fact is that even in the Declaration of Independence, there is a sentence that says clearly we are looking to achieve peace with our Arab neighbors, and we want to be part of the prosperity of the Middle East. And Israel has achieved a lot in the last 73 years. And we think that by achieving peace with our neighbors, we can achieve more, not just for us, but also for our neighbors.
I was, so impressed the fact that now we have an Arab party in the government. What is unique is that we had before Arab parties in 51 and so forth, and also 77 in Israeli in the coalition, but not to this extent, whereby we
never had an Arab party within the coalition.
Not the coalition.
Had Arab country in the Knesset, in the parliament, since the creation of the State of Israel, but we never had Arab party within the coalition. This is the first time.
Unique.
It's unique, and I think it's a very positive. Looking at the future of the Israeli society, Israel, there are 21% of there's 21% of Israelis are Arab, and they should be part of the political life as well.
Question: what do we say to people who believe? Wait a second, maybe this coalition of the Arabs party being involved in the coalition, being involved in the government, maybe it's really, so to speak, a trick that maybe they're trying to get into Israeli politics, and somehow they're going to try to sabotage Israel in the long run. Is that a possibility, or is it just paranoia, people?
There are a lot of conspiracies about it. Sorry, you really cannot answer all those conspiracy theories. I think that the Israeli Arabs are part of the Israeli society. They are part of our day-to-day life. They study with us. They work with us. They are part of our society, and they are treated as equals within the state of Israel. This is how democracy works.
I can attest myself, because I live in Israel, and I see Arab doctors and Arab judges and Arabs, businessmen, and so forth, running banks and so forth. So when people say Israel is apartheid, it's the farthest thing from being an apartheid. And the fact that now you say that we have an Arabs coalition in Israel, and part of the coalition party, that's an incredible statement that proves that we're not an apartheid.
Rabbi, I can say even more than that. For years, we have Arab diplomats representing the state of Israel, both Muslims and Christians and Druze, that they are the face of Israel around the world. We have Arab as ambassadors. It's not a new thing within the diplomatic corps of the state of Israel, and we are very proud of it, because the fact that Israeli Arabs represent the state of Israel, the Jewish state of Israel, is a unique thing. And if someone calls Israel an apartheid state, it's either out of ignorance or out of hate. And we can deal with both things, but ignorance is the most dangerous thing. And especially when you look today, we see so many ignorance when people are talking about Israel. You said clearly they talk about Israel and under this government, and to say Israel is an apartheid state. Look at the government that we have. Everyone can look at the members of the cabinet and say we have someone that represents us in this coalition, whether it's right wing or left wing, women and men, Arabs and Jews, Ethiopian people, the immigrants from Ethiopia, from Europe, from the United States, and from Russia. This is the face of the Israeli society. This is a government that represents all parts, or most of the parts of the Israeli society.
What you said before about the Ethiopian Jews, I just saw a wonderful Facebook post of a Ethiopian young lady, and she says people don't understand that Zionism is not only about white Jews, it's about black Jews or brown Jews. And in fact, the oldest Jewish community is the Ethiopian Jewish community from the time of the first temple, from over 2,700 years ago. So question, what can we do to bring the message to young people? Because unfortunately, there's so much anti-Semitism on campus, so much false narratives, there's so much hatred being developed. Even high school students believe that this Israel is a terrible place. We're doing genocide, we're massacring people, and so forth. It's all fake news. So what can we do to change people's minds?
As I said, the problem is ignorance, and the only solution to ignorance is education. And we must educate our own people and to explain what the real face of Israel is. And we have to educate the students that are not Jewish and to bring them to Israel to see for themselves. And I think the best way to understand Israel is to visit Israel. Israel is a unique place. A lot of the people that see Israel through the filters of the social media or even traditional media don't see the reality of the state of Israel. So what we are trying to do in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is either bring people to Israel or bring Israel around the world. And we do that with activity that has to do with minorities in Israel and with the technology of Israel and the cyber security in Israel, things that are relevant to people around the world, and that actually shows that Israel is part of Tikkun Olam. It's a part of making your world a better place. I remember that when I've been to Miami, we launched a project that had to do with bringing water to third world countries. There's so many places in the world that the only water they have comes out of Israeli technology. And the fact is that water, as we all know, means life. Israel is actually bringing life to this world.
Do you, now in terms of living, you said lived in Florida, and you've experienced the Jewish community in Florida. Why do you think, because I've spoke to many Jewish people in the areas, in this areas meaning the United States, and there's a disconnect. And I've seen it. It started basically from 1982 and above, after the Lebanon War. Many American Jews were just shocked what was happening. Israel going to Lebanon, going into Beirut, and so forth, and what was happening, the casualties, and people were shocked. How do we explain to the American Jewish community that you still should support Israel? You may be, let's say, you may have critique on the Israeli government, but Israel should be the focus of the Jewish nation. And one can still be an American, and one can still be a lover of Israel. What do you suggest for that?
First of all, knowing the Jewish community in Florida, I can say there is no other Jewish community in the world that is as pro-Israel, as Zionist as the Jewish community in Florida. I really miss all you guys, my friends, and I've experienced the hug that Israel has and the love for Israel from so many community congregations from all streams of Judaism in South Florida. I think the Jews have to understand that the reason that Israel exists. The fact is that for the first time in 2,000 years, we control our fate and destiny. We are no longer in the mercy of rulers or that will decide to expel us from one place or to move us to another place. And we should live under those circumstances of this territory or another. Israel, the creation of the state of Israel changed that, and it unfortunately it took it cost 6 million people, the death of 6 million people in the Holocaust, in order for the world to understand why Zionism is so important. Because now, if a Jew, wherever he lives, whenever he wants, knows that he has a place to go to, and there's a safe haven for him when he needs it. And I really hope that there will never be a reality where Jews around the world will have to all immigrate to Israel, but they have to know that they are part of this project that we've built in Israel, whether they are from the left wing or right wing, whether they are a part of a Jewish congregation or not. Israel will be there for them if they need it.
In terms of Zionism, because people sometimes may think that the Holocaust created Zionism. Zionism came many, many years before the Holocaust. So can you explain something?
No. First of all, Zionism was created as part of the Jewish tradition. The political Zionism was created in the late 19th century. But Zionism is, as I said before, saying this sentence, "L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim," is the essence of Zionism. The fact that Jews want to come back to our homeland is nothing. It hasn't been part of a political movement. In the late 19th century, it became a political movement, not as a personal desire to go back to Israel, but a national desire. Because if you consider Jews not to be just a religion, but also a nation, you understand why Zionism is a natural evolvement of the Jewish tradition.
That's a very, very excellent point you're saying. In other words, to be Jewish is to be connected to your land. It's to be connected to your tradition.
We are the indigenous people of the land of Israel. Our nation was created here. We were forced to leave the land of Israel, but we have never left. Israel never left us, and that's the fact. My family was expelled from Spain more than 500 years ago, and they knew that they're going to go to Israel. It was in 1492, and they knew that and they lived in Spain for generations. But they knew that once they leave Spain, they'll go to live in the Holy Land of Israel, because this is our homeland.
It's just an amazing story. Here we are 2,000 years ago, all of us living in Israel. The Romans conquer us. We try to fight for independence. We are totally indigenous to our land, our culture, our traditions, our music, our thinking. If everyone looks in the prayer book, we're constantly obsessed with Israel. Our holidays are obsessed with Israel. Even in marriage, we break the glass to remind us of Jerusalem, of Israel. And so, as you said, we kicked out of kicked out of Israel by the Romans. Your family went to Spain. My family went somewhere else in Europe. Then when the Inquisition happened in 1422, your family said it's time to go back to the land of Israel. My family came back also in the 1870s, before Zionism as a political movement started. So it shows.
And my European side, my Ashkenazi side, came back, immigrated to Israel in 1920 from Lithuania. My grandparents came, and then they brought their brothers and sisters and their parents, and the ones that stayed behind were vanished in the Holocaust. Basically, I can say in a very clear way, Zionism saved my family from the Holocaust. The ones that were Zionists moved to Israel. They were part of the builders of the Israels in the 1920s and the 1930s, before the Holocaust. The ones that stayed behind disappeared.
So it shows you to what extent the Jewish soul is connected to the land. It has nothing to do, like I said, politics. The political movement later on became like a structure, a machine to bring out that emotion, to bring out that need to go back home. So people don't understand that. Many people think that it's just, so to speak, a reaction to the Holocaust. It's not. It's the Jewish nature. It's a Jewish heart. It's a Jewish heart expressing itself.
Unfortunately, it took the Holocaust to explain or for the nation of the world to understand the necessity of a Jewish state.
So, why do you think now people are beginning to forget the Holocaust or have a denial of the Holocaust? Before you answer the question, just about 2 weeks ago, my wife, who works in the medical profession, had two patients, and both of them 95, one 95, one 93, and Holocaust survivors. And she saw on the Holocaust survivor the numbers, and she immediately took a picture of that and she put it on Facebook. And people were stunned because all of a sudden they saw, why would a 95-year-old man still have numbers on his arm? Because it really did happen. People are trying to deny the Holocaust. So why do you think people are denying the Holocaust? And there's so much proof to it. We have the gas chamber still around. We have people who are still around. We have testimonies by Nazis themselves, and yet people don't believe it really happened.
Well, I'm trying to be a diplomat, but you can't really explain evil, and the deniers of the Holocaust are part of an evil force. And I don't know what brings them to this part of this ideology. It's obviously has nothing to do with history, has nothing to do with being a scholar. It's a part of anti-Semitism, and I really cannot explain that. What I can explain, and what I think that it's very important for us to understand, is we are a very fortunate generation. First of all, we were born when the Jewish nation or Jewish state exists, and we don't understand the necessities that was before the creation of Israel. The second way we are very fortunate is that we have a chance to hear firsthand the stories of the Holocaust survivors, and it comes with a responsibility, because within a few years we will be the last people that heard the story, and our responsibility is to move the torch of the memory of the Holocaust to future generations. When we will have to tell the stories of the Holocaust survivors that we've met, and to tell them it really happened, and to fight against the deniers of the Holocaust, because it will be easier for them when the last Holocaust survivor will die. But we will still be here, and we will tell the story, and we will never forget, as they say, what happened, and we will see to that, and no one will forget the Holocaust. When we say never again, it's not just for the Jewish people. We're not just talking about another Shoah for Jews. Never again means we will not allow any systematic genocide to take place. This is part of the legacy also of the Jewish people and the state of Israel.
So then some listener who's watching the show right now will say to you, that sounds very nice, sir, but isn't Israel making a Holocaust, a genocide against the Palestinians? Prove to me you're not.
First of all, not at all. And people who accuse Israel of committing that is just out of ignorance. Israel has a conflict with the Palestinians. Actually, Israel is under attack from the day one of its creation. We have tried many times to reach a peace agreement with the Palestinians, and unfortunately, we have failed because the Palestinians were not able to accept the existence of the state of Israel. All this propaganda that compares what the reality between Israel and the Palestinians to the Holocaust is nothing but fake news, and that people are trying to legitimize the state of Israel. It's not true. Talking about it is part of or is considered as part of anti-Semitism. And as I said before, in order to fight ignorance and anti-Semitism, we have to educate people.
In 1948, how many Palestinians were there? Would you? Could you?
That's a great question because they weren't really Palestinians. The term Palestinian people was created in 1929. No one used the term Palestinian people before that. I've studied my bachelor degree in Tel Aviv University in communication. Part of the studies we've studied the linguistics, and we've learned that the humankind uses language in order to communicate, and part of using language is naming things that exist. This is how we do things. We see something, we call it, we name it, and that's how we communicate. And the fact that the Palestinian people, the term Palestinian people, was only used for the very first time in 1929 is actually a proof that it never existed before because no one named it before. Actually, Palestinians were Jews that lived in that land. My grandmother, that was born in Tzfat in 1917, we had a Palestinian passport. The Palestinian people, as they are recognized today, did not exist at that time. And when we mentioned the partition plan of the UN in 1947, it actually talked about two states. The Jewish state, it had no name at that time, and the second state was called an Arab state, not a Palestinian state. Moreover, that from 1948 to 1967, the land that the Palestinians now claim as the future Palestinian state, was actually under an Arab control, both by Egyptians and Jordanians. No one at that time thought that this land would be the Palestinian land or the Palestinian homeland. And only when Israel conquered that land, they started talking about the Palestinian, making those parts as the future Palestinian state. So it's a tricky question. There were Arabs that lived in Israel. Most of them were immigrants from other countries in the Middle East. They came with the Jews. Jews came from Europe. Jews came from North America to build the Jewish state. They needed help, and the Arabs from around the Middle East came to work with Jews in that land. Their numbers, there were probably about 2 million Arabs that lived, or around 1.5 and 2 million Arabs that lived in the land of Israel at that time. But there were a lot of changes from then to now. There are a lot of Arabs that left the Jewish state because they thought they will be able to come back after the 7 Arab armies will demolish the new Jewish state that was created. But unfortunately, as I said, for them, that it never happened, and they stayed out. The Arabs that stayed are still Israeli citizens, and there are only Arabs that live under a democratic state in the Middle East.
So in 48, there was 1948. There was about 1.52 million Arabs who were.
It depends on the historians.
Historians, but that number. And now in 2021, around the world, how many Palestinians are there of people who call themselves Palestinians?
No, the Palestinian. You're talking about the Palestinian refugees from 1948, yes. And there are over 5 million Palestinian refugees, according to UNRWA, which is the UN agency for Palestinian refugees. And this is a unique treatment that Palestinians received from the UN, because unlike any other refugee in the world, they can become citizens of a third country but remain Palestinian refugees. They can actually give the status of the Palestinian refugee for generation, to move it from one generation to another. And people that are actually citizens of the United States, the countries in Latin America, the European countries, still hold the status, the UN status of a Palestinian refugee, maintaining that conflict, that's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict a lot.
So you're saying that the UN is continuing this conflict when they can easily have absorbed people into their different countries without calling
They did absorb. Actually, they did absorb. The only countries that did not absorb the Palestinians were our countries. Palestinians that live in Chile today are actually, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that live there, are citizens of Chile, but they still being considered Palestinian refugees.
So the Arabs themselves did not absorb their brethren, and those in other countries are absorbed but still considered refugees. That's
Exactly.
it's basically so the victims are being caused not by the Jewish state, not by Israel, but being caused by UNRWA and the Arab states. So now, so before the question I asked before about 2 million and 48, and now 5 million Palestinian refugees around the world. How many are people living in Gaza, and how many people living in so-called the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, who are Palestinian? How many Arabs are there? Would you say?
In Gaza, there are about 1.5 million uh, citizens or inhabitants, and then in Judea and Samaria, there are about 2.5 million. Depends
And
on the
what?
numbers as well. This is not an accurate number, and there are many versions to it as well.
So from 67, when we were able to get back our land in 67, has the Arab population in the West Bank or in Gaza has gone down, or has it increased over the years, or the same?
It's increased, and I see your point, and that's true. The accusation of a genocide of ethnic cleansing is, if we are doing that, we are failing miserably. But
Yes.
that's not the main answer to why there is no genocide. It's a proof, but the main answer is that we are not. We are actually trying to achieve peace with our neighbors. We understand that this is in the land of Israel. There is another people that live here, and we have to find a solution for this conflict and this situation. We have tried a lot, and we have paid a price for trying to achieve peace. For example, Israel left the Gaza Strip in 2005, thinking that Palestinians could take the Gaza Strip as an example to how to demonstrate to the world that they can actually control their own territory. And they made the Gaza Strip into a terror territory that it's controlled by a terror organization, Hamas, that was they kicked the Palestinian Authority out, actually killing hundreds of them, and using it as a terror base to attack Israel. And by doing so, committing two war crimes. First of all, attacking civilians in Israel, and secondly, using a civilian areas to attack Israelis, to launch their attack on Israelis.
You made a wonderful point a moment ago. You're saying by the very nature of us, the Jewish people, we cannot commit genocide because that's against our whole philosophy. That's against our nature. That's against our thinking. That's against our experience. And if people don't believe that,
it's not the reality. It's not even a matter of a philosophy and culture. This is not a reality. People who claim that are actually ignorant to what is going on, or they are trying to move a propaganda issue of delegitimizing Israel.
and the numbers prove that, because if there was a genocide, there would have been less Arabs in the last 50 years. Just the opposite. There's more Arabs. There's more Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and so forth. Questioning
And that's
before we make
another issue, that
yes.
the natural growth among the Palestinian people is among the highest in the Arab societies in the Middle East. So it's not the issue of the Palestinian people that are actually disappearing. They are growing, and this is a natural growth. This is and it's still up to us and the Palestinians to find a solution how the Palestinian people, and the state of Israel could live in peace.
Before we mention about the double war crime that Hamas is doing, one killed, aiming at our civilians, and two using their civilians as shields. Okay, the question is, but what about Israel, the superpower, and so forth? Can't we just say the opposite argument, say the following? Because Israel is such a superpower, has such amazing military and air force and so forth, and has amazing weapons, that if really we were this conqueror and this evil nation state, we really could have just wiped everybody off, but we don't. just the opposite. In
That's
fact,
true.
is it true or not true that we provide the Gazans with electricity and water? Is that true?
It is true, but Israel and the Israeli army is doing more than any other army in history. Is doing more to prevent casualties among the Palestinians that are not involved. Our goal, we are not fighting the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, we are fighting the terror organization Hamas. The only targets we have are military targets of this terror organization, both the terrorists themselves, the militants, or their terror infrastructure in Gaza. When Hamas puts its terror infrastructure among the Palestinian people, it's their responsibility because under the international war law, this is once you use a civilian infrastructure with a military objective, this is a military target. But we can show once and again that Israel is doing so many things in order to prevent casualties among the innocent Palestinians, but still Hamas is actually benefiting from every Israeli that died and from every Palestinian that dies. And the only solution for that is to stop the control of Hamas over the Gaza Strip. This is not the role of Israel. The way Israel would do that is with a military power. This is the role of the Palestinians to move Hamas, to free Gaza from Hamas. This is the main issue.
Since 1948 until now, how many Jewish civilians, Israeli civilians, because also Israelis are not just only Jewish, also non-Jewish civilians, have been killed by terrorists?
I think the numbers are a few thousand, over 5,000 Israelis were killed but I don't have the exact number.
That's a great deal.
There are a lot of Israelis that were killed and a lot of Israeli soldiers that were killed in the wars. The fact is that Israel is doing its best not only to protect the civilians in Israel and to defend the citizens of Israel, but also to protect and to the civilians in the Palestinian side. Our conflict is not with the Palestinian people. Our conflict is with a terror organization, and it's important to understand that. The terror organization is using its own people as a human shield. They are actually, instead of the army defending civilians, the civilians in the Gaza Strip are defending the terrorists.
When Hamas missiles launched into Israel, does it make a difference between the Israeli Arab and the Israeli Jew? It makes a difference what it is.
No, they don't. Actually, Hamas, during the last conflict in Gaza, a few of the people that died in Israel were actually Arabs that live in the mixed city of Lod, and there are other missiles landed in other neighborhoods that were most of the population and the neighbors are Arabs. And as I said, this is a double war crime. They are launching their missiles against civilians. It doesn't matter whether they're Arabs or Jews, but they are Israeli civilians or citizens. And they are doing that by putting their own people in danger. But they do understand that Israel will do its best in order not to arm the ones that are not involved.
I remember 2 weeks ago that the director of UNRWA, UNRWA in Gaza, said himself that he was very impressed with the Israeli Air Force that was able to do such precise attacks on these Hamas strongholds, and they did their utmost not to hurt civilians. And
exactly, and he was kicked out of Gaza because he said that, and that's another issue. Gaza is not a free place for journalism, and a lot of the information that comes out of Gaza is filtered by Hamas as part of their propaganda.
So that, in terms of their propaganda, what can we do in our propaganda? Because you see how they use lies, how they manipulate things. how they try to even turn Jews against Jews and non-Jews against Jews, and how they completely even ruin their own cause for peace. Are the idea is this way, or the question maybe is the Palestinian people, are they different from their Palestinian leadership? In other words, do they want peace as opposed to the leadership? And if the leadership doesn't want peace, is because of the great money they make from donations and so forth? Is it a business for them? Why there's so much into? Or is it just are they really quote unquote freedom fighters? Are they really nationalists who just want a state?
Actually, I think that you should ask the Palestinians that. I do believe that most of the Palestinians do want peace. Maybe it's not their same vision as we have of peace, but they do want to live in peace. The Hamas is a jihadistic organization. It's not a business for them. It's an extremist Islamic organization and Islamic ideology. They are working towards a jihad, a holy war, and that's the main problem. We don't have a problem with the Palestinians, the civilians that live in Gaza. We do have a problem with the terror organization that controls the Gaza Strip.
I know your time is very valuable. Just two more questions. In terms of the Iranian deal, now people usually think it's a Jewish problem, but I recently read an article that let's assume there was an atomic war between Pakistan and India. People within about 2 weeks' time, half the world would starve because why? The sun would be blocked from all the radiation, and later on, all the production of food and so forth would not happen because the sun would be blocked. So in about 2 months' time, there's so much we have food around the world for people in terms, unless we produce food all the time, that people will start starving. That being the case, why doesn't Israel sometimes show that, okay, fine, you, the world, don't care about the Jewish state. We understand that. But if Iran does get an atomic bomb and there's an atomic war, guess what? It won't be just a Jewish problem. It's going to be a global problem.
We do say that it's not just about food. Iran is an enemy of Israel, but it's an enemy of most of the countries in the Middle East, and those countries are as concerned as we are from the Iranian military nuclear project, and we do think that it's not just an Israeli issue. It's also a European issue. It's an issue for the entire free world because the Iranian goal is not just to conquer Israel, it's to conquer the Middle East and to move the revolution, the Islamic revolution, towards other parts of the world. And especially today, a few days after the elections in Iran, when they chose the butcher from Tehran, one of the most extremist presidents, not one of them, the most extremist president in the Iranian history, the world should wake up and see the threat that Iran represents, and especially the nuclear program that is a threat for Israel, a threat for the stability of the Middle East, and a threat for the entire free world.
You have a great advantage because you've been around the world, you've been different cultures, you've lived with different people, you've seen different types of forms of government and so forth. From your own experience, and please, be as honest as you can. I'm sure you will be, because I'm asking you a question about Israel, so things are always personal. But do you really think, from a political, social, and military point of view, that Israel is basically the front line of democracy in the world? That it's really holding against the forces of those who want to change the world order to a dictatorship or get rid of Western values and try to bring the oppression of human beings, and Israel's basically the one who's holding the fort?
I don't know if Israel is the front line. Israel is a front line. There are a lot of other front lines for democracy, and as representatives of the free world, the Western culture in the Middle East, we're definitely the ones that are holding the flag here, but it's not the only one. And there are other countries that are fighting for democracy around the world. And it's worth to mention the amazing role that the United States has for decades for promoting democracy and around the world. And this is an important role for Israel, but it's also important for the people that live under a dictatorship, either dictatorships around the world.
Thank you so much for your time. I
Thank you.
want, thank you. Just one thing to the audience. We learned amazing information here in the last hour. One of the most important things we learned that Zionism is not a political movement. It's basically the psychological, spiritual essence of the Jewish nation. Our connection to the land goes beyond politics, goes beyond any type of historical moment or period. It exactly is the definition and essence of the Jewish mindset, the Jewish heart. And we learned also, very importantly, that the Jewish people are about peace. We care about peace. We want peace. And we try and do everything possibly for peace. And that we are here as a united Jewish front, meaning what? The Jews should come together with non-Jews, trying to understand and help defend Israel, because Israel is this bastion of democracy in the Middle East. And more so, it is a bastion of Jewish thought and morals and ethics that has been given to the world and gives the world a light unto the nations. So thank you so much for being part of the show. And
thank you so much for inviting me. And one last message: we've been to an amazing year. The last year has been amazing. We had the COVID, we had the COVID crisis around the world that actually, in a way, distanced us from one another, creating islands of each and every country, but also brought us together through technology. The fact that we're doing this broadcast through Zoom is one of the examples for that. We had a peace process that was really a major change in the history of the Middle East, the Abraham Accords and the new peace and normalization agreement that we signed with 4 Arab countries in the Middle East. And also we had a conflict that showed us that it's true, we were dreaming of a new Middle East, but we still live in the old Middle East, and we have to deal with that as well.
Thank you so
much. This is a great opportunity to invite all of you to come and visit Israel. Hopefully very soon the borders will be opened again, and you can see the amazing miracles that happen here almost every day.
So you have a personal invitation now to come to Israel.
Exactly. We are waiting for you here in Jerusalem.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Shalom.
Shalom, shalom.